motorcycle taxi driver is delivering food on a quiet street in Jakarta. Seconds later, he's dead, run over by a police-armored vehicle. The footage hits social media within the hour. Within days, government buildings are on fire, lawmakers are fleeing their own homes, and a country of 280 million people is staring down its most serious political crisis in over 2 decades. This isn't 1998. This is Indonesia. And the man who died delivering someone's dinner may have just triggered the biggest challenge to Prabowo Subianto's presidency since he took office. Stick around, because this story goes a lot deeper than one tragic accident. Every uprising needs a spark, and this one is almost insultingly small on paper. Indonesian lawmakers, members of the DPR, the House of Representatives, quietly approved a new monthly housing allowance for themselves, worth roughly 50 million rupiah, close to $3,000. To put that in perspective, that single monthly perk is worth several times the average monthly wage of the ordinary Indonesians those lawmakers are supposed to represent. In a country already squeezed by rising living costs, stagnant wages, and a wave of layoffs, this wasn't just tone deaf. It read like a declaration that the political class had one set of rules and everybody else had another. Protests broke out on August 25th outside the Parliament building in Jakarta. At first they were peaceful. Students, gig workers, ride-hailing drivers, ordinary citizens holding handwritten signs demanding the allowance be scrapped. And Indonesia's political elite responded exactly how you'd expect a class of people to respond when they assume no one is really watching, with contempt. One lawmaker was reported to have dismissed the protesters outright, calling them the dumbest people in the world. That single line didn't stay contained to a press briefing. It spread across social media, screenshotted, translated, mocked, and shared by millions. And in doing so, it quietly transformed a policy complaint into something far more dangerous for the government, a referendum on an entire ruling class. Then came August 28th, the day this crisis stopped being about money. Affan Kurniawan was 21 years old. He worked as an ojek driver, part of Indonesia's massive army of motorcycle taxi and delivery riders, who form the backbone of the country's gig economy, the invisible workforce, keeping Jakarta's food, packages, and people moving every single day. He wasn't protesting. He wasn't part of the demonstration at all. He was simply working, caught near the edge of the crowd while making a delivery. A police tactical vehicle drove directly into the crowd. Kurniawan was run over and killed almost instantly. Footage of his death spread across every major platform within hours, and the symbolism was impossible to ignore. A young man from the working class, grinding out a living on gig economy wages, crushed by an armored vehicle representing the very state accused of protecting the rich while crushing everyone beneath them. This is the exact moment the protests stopped being about a housing allowance. They became about something far bigger: police brutality, systemic corruption, and a government many Indonesians now see as fundamentally rigged against the people it claims to serve. Within days, unrest spread from Jakarta to cities across the entire archipelago. Government buildings were set ablaze. Lawmakers' private homes were attacked. Riot police responded with tear gas, water cannons, and rubber bullets, turning entire city blocks into running battlegrounds. By the peak of the crisis, official figures placed the death toll at 10, with roughly 20 more people reported missing. Here's what a lot of the international coverage got wrong, treating this like a spontaneous eruption over one tragic incident. It wasn't. This was the release valve on months, arguably years, of accumulated pressure. Earlier in the year, student demonstrators had already taken to the streets over budget cuts to public services and the growing role of Indonesia's military in civilian governance, a deeply sensitive issue in a country that spent decades under military-backed authoritarian rule. Layer on top of that is rising living costs, waves of layoffs in key industries, new tax burdens on ordinary citizens, paired with visibly lavish perks for politicians, and long-simmering allegations of corruption tied to Indonesia's most powerful political dynasties, including the family of former President Joko Widodo. The deeper structural issue analysts keep pointing to is this: Indonesia's police are increasingly viewed not as neutral enforcers of the law, but as the enforcement arm of an oligarchic elite, an institution that treats public protest as disorder to be managed rather than a message to be heard. When force from that institution becomes routine instead of scandalous, you get exactly what Indonesia experienced: a population that stops believing meaningful reform is even possible through official, sanctioned channels. That is the precise moment organised protest tips over into open rioting. Not because people suddenly became violent, but because they concluded, rightly or wrongly, that peaceful pressure alone was never going to be heard. Older Indonesians watched this entire sequence unfold with a very specific, very historical kind of dread. In 1998, a currency collapse, combined with decades of entrenched elite corruption under Suharto's dictatorship, triggered nationwide riots that ultimately toppled a 32-year regime, one of the defining political ruptures in modern Southeast Asian history. And unsettlingly, some of the exact same warning signs resurfaced this time around, including reports of power blackouts in parts of Jakarta shortly before looting broke out, echoing the pattern from those final chaotic days before Suharto's fall. To be clear, nobody serious is claiming Prabowo is on the verge of the kind of collapse Suharto faced. The political and economic conditions are different in important ways, but the simple fact that ordinary Indonesians, seasoned journalists, and regional analysts are even drawing this comparison out loud to tell you how seriously this moment is being treated inside the country, even as Western headlines largely moved on within a news cycle or two. As the unrest matured, protesters organized around a more formal list of demands, pulling the military fully out of civilian governance roles, reversing lawmaker pay and perk increases, launching genuine, independent investigations into corruption allegations, and taking concrete, measurable steps to address the economic insecurity driving so much of the anger in the first place. The government's response followed a familiar playbook, a mix of concessions and continued force. Some allowance reversals were announced. Promises of accountability were made regarding the officers connected to Kurniawan's death. And yet, crackdowns on remaining demonstrators continued in the weeks that followed, even as official rhetoric shifted toward reconciliation. Whether Prabowo's government actually follows through on structural reform, or simply waits for public anger to burn itself out the way so many governments before it have, is the question that will ultimately determine whether this becomes a genuine turning point for Indonesia, or just another chapter in a cycle the country has now lived through more than once. Indonesia is Southeast Asia's largest economy, a G20 member, and a country both Washington and Beijing are actively courting for influence right now. What happens on its streets doesn't stay confined to Jakarta. It directly shapes how stable the region's most important player really is. Underneath all the trade deals, defense agreements, and diplomatic photo ops making headlines elsewhere, a 21-year-old delivery driver lost his life doing an entirely ordinary job on an entirely ordinary day. Whether his death actually changes anything meaningful about how Indonesia is governed, that story is still being written in real time. If you want us to keep tracking exactly where this goes, hit subscribe. This channel exists to go past the headlines everyone else stops at.